Look at a map of the world right now. Pick any line on it. There's a good chance that line was drawn by someone who never set foot in the place it cuts through. Not a farmer, not a family. A stranger in a room, thousands of miles away, holding a ruler. You've probably never thought about that line as a weapon, but it is one. Borders feel permanent. They feel like facts of nature, like rivers or mountains. But most of them are younger than your grandparents. And the ones that cause the most bloodshed today were often drawn in a single afternoon by people who cared more about convenience than about the millions of lives on either side of the pencil mark. Here's the strange part. The real reason borders cause war isn't because people disagree about where the line should go. It's because of who drew it, why they drew it, and what they ignored on purpose. Start with your own sense of home. Your brain doesn't think in straight lines. It thinks in relationships. Who your neighbors are, who you trade with, who you marry into, whose language sounds like yours. Anthropologists have a term for this: kinship and exchange networks. For most of human history, that's what defined a territory, not a border, a web of people who depended on each other. Then came the map table. In 1884, the major powers of Europe sat down in Berlin to divide an entire continent, Africa. Nobody from Africa was in the room. Historian Thomas Pakenham, who spent years reconstructing the event, described it less as a negotiation and more as a carving. A group of men splitting territory the way you'd split a cake, using rulers and rough sketches of rivers they'd never seen. Villages were sliced in half. Rival ethnic groups were fused into single colonies. Old trading partners ended up on opposite sides of a line that meant nothing to them and everything to the men who drew it. Why did the borders end up straight, arbitrary, and disconnected from who actually lived there? Because straight lines are easy to draw and easy to defend on paper. They weren't designed to keep peace. They were designed to keep bookkeeping simple for people who would never live with the consequences. This is where the science gets uncomfortable. Economists Alberto Alesina, William Easterly, and Janina Matuszewski spent years studying what they called artificial states, countries whose borders split ethnic groups apart or forced rival groups together with no regard for existing social ties. Their research found something striking. The more artificial a border is, the less it reflects real human geography, the more likely that country is to experience civil conflict, weak institutions, and slower economic growth decades later. Not centuries later, decades. The wound doesn't heal, it compounds. Think about what that means. A line drawn in an afternoon in 1884 can still be killing people in 2026. You might assume this is only an African story. It isn't. Political scientist Jeffrey Herbst studied how European colonizers, unlike earlier African states, defined their territory almost entirely by external borders rather than by actual control of the land inside them. Older African political systems had built power outward from a capital, with authority fading gradually toward the edges, because governing dense forest or open savanna that way made practical sense. Colonial powers threw that logic out. They defined a country by its outline first and worried about who was inside it second. The border came before the nation, not after. That's backwards from how almost every stable, long-lasting political community in human history was formed. Now walk east. The same pattern repeats with a different pen. In 1916, two diplomats, Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France, met in secret to divide the Ottoman Empire's Arab territories between their two countries once the war ended. They used a ruler and a map with almost no attention to the ethnic, religious, or tribal lines already on the ground. The agreement carved out zones of British and French control that would eventually harden into modern national borders across the Middle East. populations that had lived under flexible, overlapping systems of local and imperial authority for centuries were suddenly assigned to brand new nation-states, defined from Europe, that didn't map onto how people actually saw themselves. You're seeing the aftershocks of that penstroke on the news tonight. Still, here's the counterintuitive twist, and it's the part most people get wrong. You'd think the problem is simply that the wrong groups got mixed together. Fix the mixing, fix the war. But researchers studying civil conflict, including work associated with economist Paul Collier at Oxford, found something more unsettling. Ethnic diversity itself isn't the strongest predictor of war. What matters more is whether a state has the legitimacy, the institutions, and the economic opportunity to manage that diversity peacefully. An artificial border doesn't just mix people up, it usually installs a weak, extractive government on top of them. One built to ship resources out, not to build trust within. So the border isn't just a line, it's a delivery system for weak institutions. And weak institutions are what turn ordinary human difference into organized violence. This is where it stops being ancient history and starts being your evening news. Look at the borders still driving conflict in 2026, and you'll find the same fingerprint. Lines drawn by outsiders over populations who were never consulted, on top of resources, oil, water, minerals, ports, that made the line worth fighting over in the first place. Add decades of weak or extractive governance on either side of that line, and you have a structure built almost perfectly for conflict to keep reigniting, generation after generation, long after the original map makers are dead. None of this means every current conflict has the same cause or the same solution. Wars are never that simple. But it does mean the questions worth asking are rarely, which side is right? They're older and more useful. Who drew this line? What did they ignore? And what would it take after a century to let the people living on either side of it actually decide what kind of border or what kind of shared future makes sense for them, instead of the one a stranger sketched out with a ruler? Your brain still wants a simple map, a clean line, a clear inside and outside, us and them. That instinct is old. It kept small groups safe for most of human history. But the modern border, the kind carved out in a colonial office or a wartime backroom, was never built for that instinct. It was built for someone else's convenience, wearing the disguise of permanence. So look at that map again. Pick the same line. It isn't a fact of nature, it's a decision made by someone who never had to live with it that millions of people still do.